what are your recommendations for somebody who's currently planning to apply for PhD?
SOP, the statement of purpose, is one of the most important components of the application process. I think an SOP should have some possible research questions that one is inclined to pursue during PhD.
How do you judge whether the student will be a good fit?
So therefore, this is one of the most important things we look out for when we assess a candidate.
A lot of students are also using applications such as ChatGPT.
We now can't just rely on the superficial responses from the candidates. So we repeatedly ask them a lot of probing questions. A paper that is not well written cannot get into a good journal. Some of the advisors are such that they micromanage, which is okay. Their contribution is not positive, their contribution is negative.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Decoding Ph.D. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Varun Jindal, a distinguished academic from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Professor Jindal specializes in corporate finance, mergers, acquisitions, and seasoned equity offerings. With a PhD from IIM Calcutta and an impressive career spanning academia and corporate world, including roles at KPIT and Infosys, Professor Jindal brings a wealth of knowledge and practical insights to his teaching and research. His papers have been published in the Journal of Corporate Finance, the British Accounting Review, the European Financial Management, and the International Business Review. He is the recipient of several awards and honors, including the Excellence in Teaching Award at IIM Bangalore, the Distinguished Alumnus Award 2021 by Punjab University Alumni Association, the Springer Best Discussant Award at the Emerging Markets Conference 2021, and the Satish K. Sehgal Doctoral Student Award for Excellence in Scholarship and Organization Citizenship 2020 at IIM Calcutta, among others. He is also a recipient of financial support of close to $4,000 for a policy paper under NAC NYU Stern Initiative on study of financial markets in India in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Professor Varun Jindal. Hello, Professor, and welcome to the show. To start things off, please tell us about your academic journey so far. How did you end up in academia?
First of all, thank you, Sanchit. It's a pleasure to interact with you. Well, that's an interesting question. While I have worked for 6 years in the corporate sector, in the last few years of my journey, I realized that this sector is perhaps not for me. I thought that this is misfitment for me. And I was looking out for a profession, a career, which allowed me to read and write, because that is what I actually enjoyed. And then I realized that academics is one such profession where one is paid for reading and writing, right? And that is how I ended up coming to academics. I started applying for admission tests, and luckily I could get into IIM Calcutta as a PhD student, and rest of the things are history.
How did your goals evolve as you started with your PhD journey? Did they change, shift, and what are the factors which influenced that?
So when I got into my PhD, my ultimate goal was to get into an IIM which was closer to my place.
Okay.
So I am a native of Punjab, and therefore I wanted to get into IIM Amritsar. So that was my original goal with which I started my journey. And you are right, actually, the goals do evolve. That is what I realized. And after a couple of years, my goals in fact changed.
Okay.
So when I got a very decent publication, I realized that I'm not just only eligible for IIM Amritsar, but I'm also eligible for the top IIMs. And therefore, I started applying to IIM Ahmedabad, IIM Bangalore, and other top IIMs. And that's how I think my goals evolved. And once I got into IIM Bangalore, it was something which I had never thought of, even in my wildest dreams. Yeah.
That's wonderful. For our viewers, the decent publication Professor is talking of is a publication in Journal of Corporate Finance, which is an ABDC A-star journal. So it's way more than decent. In your experience, what are the key differences between pursuing a PhD in India versus pursuing a PhD abroad in terms of research output, in terms of expectations from students?
Since I have done my PhD from India, maybe I can tell you about the Indian setting. I'm not very much aware of the setting abroad. So now my ultimate goal, as I told you earlier, was to get into an IIM within India.
Right.
And therefore I thought maybe doing a PhD from India will be worthwhile, because I wanted to always get into an Indian institute. And of course, now as far as research in India is concerned, I would say that it is still far behind if we compare it with research in the top US schools.
Right.
And if one is passionate about research, and if one is willing and inclined to get into academics in a B school abroad, I think doing a PhD from a foreign school, especially some top tier US school, makes sense, definitely.
So US schools would be preferred if somebody decides to go abroad.
Yes. Yes, that's what I believe.
So, say if a student is on fence with respect to whether he should go abroad or whether he should stay in India, what are the factors he should consider in taking this decision?
Okay, the first factor, as I already mentioned, one should think of as to where one wants to get a job. Is it in India or is it elsewhere? If one is not restricted in terms of geography, right, I would suggest that it's better to do a PhD from abroad, from a decent school. Of course, it also depends on the choices an individual has, the scholarship an individual is getting, and so on and so forth. So, depending on the choices and depending on the constraints at hand, I
Right.
think one should take a decision which is optimal.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that point. You mentioned that you started applying for PhD once you got an idea that you would be better off in academia. So, applications for PhD can itself be a very daunting task. And there are multiple things that are required in addition to the basic requirements for eligibility. Students are required to submit an SOP. So, what are your recommendations for somebody who's currently planning to apply for PhD? And what should be some of the points they should consider while preparing their SOP?
Okay, so first of all, I think SOP, the statement of purpose, is one of the most important components of the application process. So one should pay a lot of attention to this particular component. Okay, now when I, as a faculty member, now look at an SOP, I can make a sense of whether the person is actually interested in research or not, right? So a well thought out SOP therefore can make a lot of difference, right? Now, what should an SOP contain? I think an SOP should have some possible research questions that one is inclined to pursue during PhD. Of course, having said that, these are not the questions one will actually pursue. As one goes through PhD, these research questions and even the area might change. Before starting with the application process, one must show that one is inclined to do a PhD. These possible research questions can come from a number of places. One can read a lot of, for example, newspaper articles, other media articles, and these might lead to some interesting questions which can be addressed in one's academic journey, right? So this is something I feel is an important component of the SOP process.
Some institutions also require students to submit a research proposal along with that. However, one of the common challenges student face is they do not really have any access to research papers or they are not really familiar with research methodologies. In such circumstances, how should a student go about preparing a research proposal?
Okay, now as far as the research methodology is concerned, I think nobody is going to test you during the interview process on research methodology. Research methodology is something which is learned during the PhD. However, the interviewing panel might be interested in knowing the research questions. And as you said, one may not have access to a lot of journal papers, right?
Right.
But one might have access to a lot of papers which are on SSRN and other repositories and other working papers, right? So therefore, what would I suggest is that one can go through those working papers and especially, if one is applying to an institute, one should look up into the profiles of faculty members, their research interests, and also try to read some of their research papers so that they can strike a conversation with the faculty members.
During the interview.
Yes.
Which leads us to our next question. So, now that you look at the student profile, how do you judge whether the student would be a good fit for PhD program or not?
Okay, the first thing we look out for is whether a student is actually motivated, whether a candidate is actually motivated to do PhD, because PhD is about research. It's not about teaching. It's predominantly about research. So one has to be well motivated to do a PhD because it's a long journey. It's a 5-year journey or 6-year journey. And therefore, if one is not motivated, the things will fall apart. This is one of the most important things we look out for when we assess a candidate. We assess this ability of the candidate in a number of ways. For example, we could look at the SOP of the candidate. We probe each of the candidates deeper into those research questions so that it should not be superficial knowledge, right?
Right.
So therefore, we are able to make out after repeated probing whether a candidate is actually interested in doing a PhD or one is just finding an escape route from the corporate world. Right? Given that the job market nowadays is not that great, we often see an influx of applications from candidates who are really not interested in doing a PhD. They just want an escape route, and this is the kind of crowd we really don't want.
So, just to put some context to this conversation, within PhD, most of the institutions in India also provide a stipend to the student. So, when somebody wants a break from corporate, they often look at PhD as one of the venues through which they can get this break and get paid some stipend at the same time. So, Professor, regarding the research proposals and SOP that we mentioned, a lot of students are also using applications such as ChatGPT and other LLM models to write their SOPs. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that is what is making our life sometimes difficult, right? Nowadays, we have to put in more time to screen candidates' applications, right? So,
Right.
therefore, we now have to probe deeper. We now can't just rely on the superficial responses from the candidates. So, we repeatedly ask them a lot of probing questions.
Right.
And the answers to these questions essentially help us know whether a candidate is actually a fit for a PhD or not.
So, in early stages of PhD, the initial period often includes coursework and some research as well. So, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think the initial phase of the PhD is, as you mentioned, comprises of coursework and some research work, right? This is actually a very structured phase of the PhD, and I would suggest that every student who is pursuing a PhD, he or she should utilize this time effectively by not just focusing on the coursework, but also reading through papers, carefully analyzing what are the potential research gaps that can be addressed going forward, trying to improve one's writing. Writing is a very crucial component of the research process. A paper that is not well written cannot get into a good journal. And similarly, I think that one should also learn some statistical package during the first 2 years of the coursework, which will come in handy if one is pursuing a quantitative research. So I think these are the areas one should essentially focus on.
Is this also the time when a student should be looking at who they want to work with?
My advisors used to tell me that your PhD supervisor is like you are getting married to somebody for next few years, right? And then you don't have a choice, right? So the choice of advisor, I think, is extremely crucial. If you ask me what is the most important decision a student takes during his or her PhD journey, I would say it's the choice of the advisor, right?
Even more than the topic?
Yes, I think it can make all the difference. I'll tell you, I have interacted with my seniors, for example, right? They used to tell me that some of the advisors are such that they micromanage, which is okay. But not just that, their contribution is not positive, their contribution is negative,
Okay.
right? Which means that whatever you are trying to do, some of them inadvertently, they might put you on a different path. They might not be able to give you guidance which you need, right? So therefore, I think the choice of a supervisor is a very important decision, and therefore one should make a choice appropriately. For example, I made a choice of my advisor. I knew that she is never gonna put negative contribution. On the other hand, I knew that she is somebody who would motivate me always. Of course, having said that, I also knew that she was not an expert in the area in which I was planning to pursue PhD, right? So there was some trade-off, but I think all in all, my decision went very well in the hindsight.
That's great to know. But as a student, when you are making this choice, you have not really worked with the professor. So, under those circumstances, how do you decide whether this would be a good fit or whether you'll get along or not?
But I think during the first 2 years of the coursework during PhD, one is exposed to different faculty members, and one does get an idea about different faculty members. There are several courses which one has to undertake under different faculty members. There are some RA opportunities, some TA opportunities, and so on and so forth. And during those opportunities, one gets exposure to different faculty members, and I think one can get a sense of whether one is going to be comfortable with somebody or not.
Utilizing that experience to also help your decision of who to choose.
Yeah, right.
That's great input again, Professor. So you mentioned that you started looking for opportunities once you had a publication in JCA. So how should one approach this process of looking for jobs? When should they start? How should they start? Is there a structure they should follow?
Actually, one should be aware of the market to which one is applying for the positions, right? For example, I was interested in applying for faculty positions within India. And therefore, what happens is that a lot of talks keep happening on campus. Your seniors keep going to different places. Therefore, I think it's crucial that one keeps interacting with one's seniors periodically. One attends all the talks which are given by heads of different institutions and so on and so forth. Because these are the things which are going to come in handy when one actually starts with the application process.
Right.
So I started my application process immediately after submitting my thesis. I made a list of the institutions I was interested in applying to. I made an Excel file. I went through each of the requirements for each of the institutes. I also figured out whether it was a rolling process or the application was in response to an advertisement, right? So these were the details I had noted down. And once I had all the details, I immediately started applying with cover letter, my teaching interests, my research interests, and my CV. The order in which one applies to different institutions for faculty positions is not the order in which one gets calls for the faculty
Right.
recruitment process. So therefore, I think it is important that one applies as soon as possible, because it takes a couple of months for one to get call and then another couple of months for one to convert the call. So there is a good amount of lead time from the time of application to the time of one getting offers from some institutions.
So it could be possible that you've applied to Institute A once and that call actually comes much later, but you already have an offer from some other institution. So how do you manage this?
Okay, I think I was asked this question. For example, even before I graduated, I had an offer from, and they had given me just 10 days to accept the offer, and I had to accept the offer. I had also applied to Bangalore. At Bangalore interview, I was asked as to whether I have any offer. Of course, I had, and I told them that I do have an offer. They asked me whether I have accepted that offer. I said, yes, I have accepted that offer. And I was also asked that if you get an offer from Bangalore, what will you do? I said, informally, I have conveyed to IIM that I am applying to IIMB, and therefore it is not a surprise for them. So therefore, I was not doing something which was unethical, in my opinion. I was doing what any other person would do, rational person would do. So therefore, of course, like a problem for the institute which has made you an offer, and once you accept an offer, ideally you should not apply to any other place, ideally.
Right.
But everyone knows that, for example, if you get into IIMA or IIMB, which are one's dream institutes in general, one is going to leave other offers. Yes.
Right.
So therefore, it's a challenging, but I think one has to make a choice for the long term.
That's a very interesting story and great learning also for us. Now that you have joined, like the next step is to balance teaching versus research, because research is a very important requirement for your promotions, confirmations, tenure, everything. And teaching at the same time is also a mandatory requirement. So how do you balance that?
Okay, first of all, I must tell you that it is not just about teaching and research. Once you join as a faculty member, in addition to teaching and research, you also have to undertake some administrative tasks which fall under the service bucket.
Okay.
So, for example, I am a member of several committees where I have to contribute. I am also doing a lot of stuff for the area. For example, I am now a course coordinator for one of the subjects. I have also been instrumental in the recruitment of academic associates. I was also a panel member for PhD applicants. I was also a panel member for interviewing MBA candidates. So therefore, there are a lot of service-related tasks as well, which are in addition to teaching and research.
Which also take a part of your time.
Yes. Having said that, of course, teaching and research take up bulk of my time. And obviously, it's a hard choice to make, as far as teaching and research are concerned. But my recommendation to any new joinee is that you have to, first of all, get or develop some confidence in teaching, right? Obviously, research you have been doing for the last few years. So when one starts teaching for the first time, my advice is that do put in some focus, do give in some focus to teaching, so that once you are settled in teaching, you can devote more time to your research.
That initial period, I understand, requires a lot more time because you're also getting familiar with the course, with methodology of teaching.
Yeah, you're right. And one has to make slides.
You are quite popular among students for your teaching also. So any inputs on how somebody can work on the teaching skills?
Okay, so first of all, I must make a disclaimer that what has worked for me may not necessarily work for others. Having said that, what I try to do is I assume that my students do not have any knowledge about the subject that I'm going to teach them. In my classes, or invariably, there are students who are chartered accountants, who are CFA level 1 or level 2 or even CFA holders. So I tell my students in the first class that I'm not going to focus on those who are chartered accountants or who are CFA holders. My main focus is going to be students who are unaware of what corporate finance is. And also, to make the subject interesting, what I usually do is I pose them a lot of questions, a lot of open questions. I don't indulge in cold calling my students, but I pose them a lot of questions, which essentially makes them think. And therefore, once they think, it helps them to retain the stuff for a longer time.
Right.
And they are also able to appreciate, is what I have recognized. So therefore, I think this is actually my way of teaching. And it may work for others, it may not work for others, but it has certainly worked for me.
No, I think as a student, I would definitely love that. Before we conclude today's wonderful session, so any advice you would like to give to PhD students who are in early stages of their career?
Okay, I think my single most important advice to any PhD student is that hard work, sincerity, and perseverance. So, these are the most important attributes of a successful PhD student. Because I have seen students who are smart, but the ones who don't work hard invariably fail. So, therefore, PhD is not about smart work. Of course, if one is smart, it is good. But if one has to be hardworking, one has to be sincere, one has to have perseverance. So one needs to put in a lot of effort, reading, writing, and learning new things. One has to be open to all these things. I think this is my advice to any budding PhD student, any student who is going to go for faculty positions in the future.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time today and for these valuable inputs.
It was my pleasure to interact with you, Sanchit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'd love to have you again.
Thank you.
Well, that was today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. We'll keep coming up with more content which will help you on your journey in PhD. Please leave us your feedback in comments and also suggestions for what you would like to see on our show. Thank you and all the best.